My name is Stanislav Kostyuk and I am a game designer. Today we'll talk about the GBA version of The Lord of the Rings: The Return of the King movie tie-in game from 2003. I wrote this video assuming you have watched my critique of the handheld Two Towers version to save time on establishing different notions, so I would highly recommend you watch it first if you haven't. There is also a video about Return of the King for consoles and PC if you're more interested in that version. Links to both are in YouTube cards and video description. Return of the King takes upon the gameplay foundation of the Two Towers and expands upon it. More mechanics, more maps. Eowyn was clearly planned from the get-go this time, so she has a nice campaign that is as long as everyone else's, and Gollum finally has a portrait picture instead of a silhouette. I guess the movie producers have decided that his pixelated glory on a handheld will not actually ruin the impression people would have of his CGI in the films. But with all that said, is the game better? Let's find out, as always, with the help of my Stasocritic scoring system, the first category of which is design. This category has the biggest weight, that of 4, as it's about the most important part of any game, how it is actually played and structured. In terms of the core pillars and core loops, everything has stayed exactly the same like in the Two Towers. What Return of the King does is touch up the implementation aspect. For example, attacking feels much more consistent. Every character has a pretty wide hit range that doesn't seem to rely on animation so much. On top of that, your character automatically turns around to the closest enemy if you press the attack button while looking the other way. As a result, the core gameplay of pressing B to kill feels much better. The range of your attacks may feel ridiculously large at times if you pay close attention to it, but for players it will be simply a matter of never feeling like an attack unfairly missed. Ranged attack aim assist also works much better, though it seems the target selection logic has been a change from the Two Towers, as sometimes Legolas's arrows can go in very unexpected directions. This is especially frustrating in moments when you're trying to prioritize a troll chasing you, while the game selects a goblin somewhere around the edge of the screen in a direction you're not even looking at. Speaking of looking, the UI has been reworked, so now your view of the space below the character isn't as blocked as before, and that's especially great for noticing Crebain. The default movement speed has been unchanged and it still feels a bit too slow, but there are so many items that can potentially speed it up that it's not that big of a deal. So the core gameplay has been polished up to a really solid state. Since we've mentioned items though, let's talk about loot, because this is another aspect that has improved greatly. Now, when it comes to base items, there actually aren't that many new ones that were added to the list from the Two Towers. But there are many more prefixes and suffixes alongside the potential effects that they might have, and that is bundled up with a much friendlier towards the player rarity, not just for uncommon items, but unique ones too. Even in the Two Towers you have to be lucky to find a single legendary item across 30 hours of gameplay. In Return of the King you'll find one within the first several hours. But the most important reason why looting works is of course the fact that all these items provide interesting choices, ranging from simpler ones like what stat boost do you value more for your build, to more complex things like what are you willing to sacrifice for a bigger effect. For example, I once found an item with a prefix named Peculiar that gives minus 27 points to strength, but plus 31 to defense alongside a 10% experience point boost. That's a really peculiar item indeed, and it has its uses. There are also properties such as Fragile. A weapon can have some really impressive bonuses, but every hit there is a chance it will break. Some weapons have armor piercing, meaning that their damage is not reduced by the enemy armor stat. And sure, such weapons tend to have lower base damage numbers, but then again you can always increase damage with strength attribute and a bunch of passive skills. So you've got interesting choices when collecting loot, and that's important. The inventory management system though, which is fully retained from the Two Towers, breaks at the seams with this amount of loot and possibilities. You can't easily compare stats between what you have equipped and what's in the inventory, have to move selection across the whole screen. You can't preview an item's stats before picking it up, or somehow compare with what item you'd like to replace. Which means if your pretty small inventory of 8 slots is full, you need to either find a place to sell your stuff or just discard an item before picking up something to check what it is. Don't get me wrong, there is nothing preventing you from making proper educated choices, but in time the process of inventory management can start feeling a bit cumbersome. Definitely a big plus is the fact that you can now share items between characters in single player. In many different spots you will find Ranger Hollows. Should you place an item there, any character can take it later from any hollow. Now you don't feel bad if you find an item fitting another character more than your current one, and also you can actually make builds focused on treasure hunting should you so desire. What devalues somewhat the amount of choices and build fine-tuning you can do thanks to the upgraded loot system is the balance of the game. Like in the Two Towers, each character has a set of active and passive skills, and a couple of exceptions aside, the more you try to focus on using active skills or an otherwise interesting build in your first playthrough, the more you're shooting yourself in the foot. Enemies in the second half of every campaign have really high defense stats, which means you'll need at least 50 points in accuracy attribute to hit them more or less consistently on normal difficulty level. Even then, it's better to pump it up to at least 60 or 70 so the success rate would be higher. This is important because your accuracy against enemy defense is calculated not only for your standard attack, but also for most of the available active skills in the game. So if you're not raising your accuracy, you're making life for yourself consistently harder. But if you're pumping points into accuracy, that means you're not pumping points into a stat like Courage, which defines how many spirit points you have, a requirement to cast active skills. And the spirit point cost is also balanced differently. While 1 Courage point is equal to 4 spirit points, unlike it being equal to 1 in the Two Towers, the spells are more expensive, and in a ratio that's not entirely beneficial for the player. I've made a mistake of trying to play my Aragorn like I did in the Two Towers, focusing on stunning enemies with command and presence in Return of the King called King's Command, and then dealing with them quickly using Sweep. You need a lot of courage stat to make that strategy work. Just the possibility to use Sweep more than 2 times in a row needs investment. And putting points in courage means that you don't put points in accuracy, which would make it possible for your Sweep to actually hit anything. Even Gandalf, a character you'd think would work in the form of a pure active skill user, being a wizard and all, will keep being less effective. If you pump all your points into courage and use a single cheapest offensive spell that you keep upgrading to pretty powerful results, you will still find yourself constantly running out of mana and not being able to cast anything. And with no accuracy stats, you won't be able to deal with enemies when you're out of spirit points. And it's not that the magic-focused build is not valid at all, it's just that in your initial playthrough you're better off focusing on a melee fighting style and passive skills. A big reason for that is the way skill purchasing works. Instead of it being a tree where as soon as one skill is unlocked you can pump as many points as you want into it, each skill can have only up to 5 points in it, and each point has a specific level requirement. So let's say skill is unlocked at level 2, you can put a second point into it only at level 4, third point at level 6, fourth at 8, and last at 10. Different skills can have different amounts of levels between each point. So if you get your example of a magic-focused Gandalf, to make him work you need to focus on skills that increase your mana regeneration, spell damage, and so on. But to do that you need to level up enough, and for that you need to kill enemies. And you can't comfortably kill enemies and survive with low accuracy for reasons I mentioned before. Now there are items that will help by boosting courage, runes that you can carve in, there is one type that helps with mana regeneration, alongside prefixes and suffixes which increase wisdom, meaning the damage of Gandalf spells. But these things are either random or require a lot of investment. All this leads to a situation where your first playthrough with any character is better off being focused on a traditional fighting style, supported by some passive and maybe one active skill, and only in the second playthrough should you focus on making the build you want. Unless you're content with constantly saving and reloading to grind in safer places before moving on. When it comes to the skills themselves, there are 2 aspects to consider, especially when comparing them to the Two Towers. First is if all of them work. And the answer to that is a resounding yes, there is not a single skill that doesn't properly work this time. The second aspect to consider is if they're interesting and useful. And here the game is at a weird position where technically it is much more reasonable and balanced than the Two Towers, but also lacking in personality. First, most of the passive skills are shared between many characters and feel pretty generic as a result, even if useful. But then the active skills can feel pretty underwhelming. Every character has 5 active skills of their own, and even if working properly, they can feel lacking in comparison to the skills from the 2 towers. For example, if in the previous game Gandalf had 3 offensive spells, meaning that with the magic-focused Gandalf you had a choice of playstyle depending on how you want to upgrade those spells, here in Return of the King he has only 1, Light Strike, so that's the only thing you get to use with that style of play. Though of course his Summon Eagle skill now works properly and can actually be useful, the Sword of Power spell is good for a fighter Gandalf, Shield is good for all types of Gandalf as before, and Blinding Aura is a working alternative to previous game's Sunburst, but one that is more useful for a melee Gandalf than a magic one. But with all that in mind, you get less choices in developing your character from the perspective of active skills. And even passive ones too, as is evident with Aragorn. In the 2 towers, through passive abilities you could choose how to develop your Aragorn, as one that uses a shield, dual blades or 2-handed swords. Here there is no choice like that. Aragorn can wield 2 weapons from the get-go, but there is no way to tune him to be more effective with that. He can have a shield, but there is no way to make a shield Aragorn build. You just get to overall increase his effectiveness and damage regardless of what he uses. Though his active skills are essentially the same as in the 2 towers. Only the power-up ability is now more useful due to not having corruption, and Cole Legolas was replaced with Cole in the Army of the Dead, and that one is pretty useless. While this game overall has a good AI for companions that on some maps follow you around and help fighting with enemies, Call of the Dead doesn't seem to use that. Each soldier has trouble detecting enemies and disappears after doing 1 hit anyway. So what feels like it should be an awesome ability, isn't. And all characters have a pretty bad and active skill kit in the end, though in many cases the skills that were taken from the 2 towers are improved. For example, Snare for Frodo is now an area of effect attack instead of shooting darts, so it is a much more useful skill. The One Ring is as powerful as ever, and Knife Throw has been fixed. You now aren't locked to stand in a single spot while the knife is in the air, and that's great. It also has auto-aim, but it is the same one as Legolas's, so at times can be very weird. The other active skills aren't great, and at the end of the day, regardless of how you upgrade your Frodo, you still will find that you need a lot of accuracy because he is essentially a fighter, only you need to decide what fighter type specifically. Gimli can be transformed into an amazing treasure hunter through his passives, but his active skill kit is again mostly about him becoming a better fighter. Eowyn too, you'll play her as a fighter that mostly uses traditional attacks. Likewise with Legolas, sure you can put points in White Knives, which is much more balanced in this game and can be useful, but for it to work you need to upgrade both accuracy and courage. But you need accuracy regardless for your bow, and really the only way to play Legolas is as a standard bowman that presses B a lot because most of his active skills are okay-ish. They're defensive in nature, but there are far better alternatives if you upgrade passives instead. Even Gollum, an unlockable character which you can play only on bonus maps, he is very interesting because he can't equip any items at all. All his damage is done through passive and active skills. But again, he's still a fighter, and while beginning to play as him is exceptionally challenging due to not having any armor or damage, you quickly realize that should you put points in accuracy stat, everything will become much more straightforward. Most of your playstyle is actually going to be defined by how you tune your equipment and passive skills, and less so by which active skills you choose to focus on. So we have this weird situation where everybody is essentially a fighter, and while if you compare the Return of the King with 2 Towers, this game certainly has much better implementation and more solid balance. But you can't really try to define a certain playstyle for each character as you could in the previous title. Here every character is a fighter, you just tune what kind of fighter they are exactly. And it works, and even makes sense design-wise due to the moment-to-moment gameplay, but it lacks personality. Still, we can't talk about skills without mentioning a bunch of great quality of life updates. First, the way the healing skill works has been changed. This time it is not upgradable and uses a special collectible Kingsfell herb item, which is a big improvement over the 2 Tower system in terms of balance and usefulness. Then you can activate in options the possibility for the healing skill to be used automatically when you go low on health. And yes, sometimes there are cases where you'd rather take a risk without healing, but most of the time there is no reason not to have this option turned on. You can also activate an alternative mode of using skills. Alongside the option to do it like in the 2 Towers, select a skill with L and use it with the A button, You can use skills through assigned shortcuts. Hold L and then press either R, A or B, and whatever skill is attached to the respective combination is going to be used. This can make battles much more fast-paced. Levels are a big improvement over the two towers as well. Don't get me wrong, in the two towers the maps did everything required for the game to work, engaging the player in battles while they are trying to find a way out. But levels in Return of the King also focus on exploration and little side quests that lead to more loot. For example, there is a Rohan map where really all you're required to do is just go straight to the exit and you'll be fine. Or you can find an entrance to a cave, pull a lever there, after which you'll have to defeat several waves of enemies in a particular spot, and then some treasure chests will appear after that. Return of the King also tries to vary up more the structure and goals of these maps. For example, Shelob's Lair naturally has a little bit of a horror vibe to it, Paths of the Dead are labyrinthine, while Rohan levels are open and wide. There are missions where you have to defeat uncommon Mumakil, light the beacons before progressing, rescue hostages, and stuff like that, adding more variety to the whole process. One downside though is that Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli all have exactly the same campaign. Now, Aragorn's and Legolas's campaigns in the two towers were largely the same, but they had differences, sometimes utilized different maps, and a lot of dialogue was different. In Return of the King, sadly, the three characters all go through exactly the same journey. On the other hand, 4 campaigns fit perfectly in the 4 save slots the game has, but it is still a pity that the technical limitations that prevented the previous game from having more are apparently still in place. After all, not only Return of the King has 6 main characters to play as, but also 2 bonus ones, Gollum and Sam. The extra characters are playable only in multiplayer and the bonus maps though, so you will have to make tough choices regarding which characters to delete. I don't have much more to add when it comes to the design of the game, so let's open up all the possible scores for this category. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to read them all. Taking everything I have talked about into account, I will assign an 8 to this game. The core gameplay is solid, the loot and choices related to it are great, the maps are fun, and it's really a great representative of the hack and slash genre. Things like cumbersome inventory management, some lack of distinction among characters, a number of useless active skills, and even difficulty curve, wonky aim assist and a number of other issues do collectively prevent the game from being considered exemplary, but Return of the King shows just how important time and iterations are for game development. The title took the foundation laid by the two towers and has made great strides to improve it, and did so successfully. Let's move on to context now. This category has a weight of 1 as it's about things that enhance the experience but don't necessarily define it. Plot, player stories, character arcs, etc. Now, like with the console version of Return of the King, we'll rate everything based on what the game does by itself, without relying on the source material. But as this is an adaptation of a sequel, assuming you know information from the first 2 movies isn't going to be considered as something necessarily negative, though we will look at the perspective of understanding what is going on if you have only played the GBA version of the Two Towers. There are 2 striking things when it comes to the narrative aspect of this Return of the King adaptation. First, the dialogues are pretty dry. Yes, a lot of lines are taken from the movie, but they're not adapted to a text-only format and as a result play a most informational role. Then, this game has very little dialogue that is not about advancing the plot. As a result, there is a distinct lack of character arcs. This is best seen in Aragorn's campaign. It does provide well enough the plot brief. Okay, first we're going to Isengard to deal with Saruman, then the party moves on to Minas Tirith, and on the way Lord Elrond tells Aragorn to go through the Paths of the Dead, so Aragorn is like, okay, yeah, we'll do it, it's time, and so on. But there is absolutely no arc of him accepting his destiny to become king to get rid of his doubts. Even Frodo's campaign, which features quite a lot of dialogue related to Frodo sending Sam home and then Sam getting back, sprinkles in those dialogues only so to transmit the information needed for the plot. But you never experience how Gollum tries to cloud Frodo's mind, or how the ring's influence over Frodo grows, or anything like that. It's just things that happen. But then, even with this dry approach to the whole narrative, the game still doesn't do enough to make everything connected together consistently. For example, it's never really clear in Eowyn's campaign why Théoden's army marched forward and she has to catch up. So not only is there a lack of any sort of character arc, but a lack of how connected is the plot itself as well. Some of the more abrupt things are related to the inclusion of Merry and Pippin. In the previous video I have mentioned how technically the two can be cut from the plot of the Return of the King game, even if they both play a big role in this story. Return of the King, though, decides to keep them in, which not only would be confusing for people who would play only the Two Towers GBA game, but in general they've been put in such a way that doesn't matter at all. Merry is just there in Eowyn's campaign at some points. Absolutely no dialogue or anything related to how he wants to help his friends. Pippin is technically the reason why Gandalf goes to Minas Tirith, but you never really learn what happened exactly. He pretty much just says full of a toque and now you're on your way. There is a moment where Gandalf says a line from the movie, how there is another chance for the Shire folk to prove their great worth. In the film, that was a heroic moment for Pippin, as he has been the one to light the beacons. In the game, well, Gandalf says that, but lights the beacons himself. Pippin is never even seen nearby. So there is a question of why the return would be necessary for this particular game. And since I have talked about the beacons, the game doesn't explain their relevance at all. In Gandalf's campaign, it's never told it is needed to summon help from Rohan, and in campaigns of Aragorn and Eowyn, they all just go to Gondor with no beacons ever involved or mentioned. And it's not the only lack of connection between different campaigns. Events aren't nearly as interconnected as those from the Two Towers, and where it feels like there is a perfect spot for such an intersection, there is none. So that's why, if we open up all the scores for context, I will assign a 4. Technically, you will understand all the important bits of the Return of the King's plot here, but not only will you be missing arcs and nice character moments, but also a bunch of things that will make the plot feel more connected and told less abruptly. Now, time to talk about aesthetics. This is another category with a weight of 1, as it's also about something that enhances the experience but doesn't necessarily define it, this time through visual style, music, sounds, etc. In the Two Towers video, I have talked about the differences between the implementation quality and the actual aesthetic part of the equation. Well, not only Return of the King greatly improves the former, but it also removes the contradictions from the latter. If locations in the Two Towers felt samey and not quite representative of the Lord of the Rings, here it's the opposite. Every area is distinct, and this applies not just to the sprite work used, but the overall feel created by the lighting and mood, which by the way is much more in line with the source material. The same can be said about the music. Like the Two Towers, this game uses a mix of movie score, this time from the first two movies rather than just the first part, and a soundtrack original to the game. The new tunes are much closer in style to the movie soundtrack. For example, here is an area utilizing the soundtrack from the movie. Here is a level with an original game score. And just for the sake of comparison, here is the Two Towers game original score from a location that can be considered similar. You can see how the tone in Return of the King is much more consistent. And besides the stylistic aspect, the implementation quality in Return of the King is stronger as well. The two towers already had strong sprite work and animations, Return of the King makes them even better, and that is propped up by fantastic character portraits, more consistent UI and menus, and since we did talk about soundtrack, improved musical quality too. Return of the King is fantastic aesthetically, there's so much attention to detail. Sadly though, there is a bit too many issues that make it feel like there's some lack of polish. You will often see weird layering, some enemies still lack animations for certain states, like for example Haradrim archers don't have stagger animation, they just stay in place. Some visual effects like water droplets from walking on it can look misplaced, things like that. This is why out of all the scores for aesthetics, I will assign a 9. There are too many little flaws that make it difficult to ignore them, but still it doesn't take away from just how amazing the overall work is on the visual and sound sides of the game. Now, let's discuss cohesion. This category has a weight of 2 and it's about how well the game connects all its different aspects together to create a wholesome, holistic experience. And today we won't spend much time here, in fact I will open up the scoreboard straight away. I will assign a 6 to Return of the King. This is less than the Two Towers as 7, yes. While there are some improvements in this regard, like the hobbits not being able to wear footwear, lack of gameplay distinction between characters that I've mentioned in the design section, and abrupt or inconclusive motivations I've mentioned in the context section, make it feel more gamey and less like the Lord of the Rings than the Two Towers did. Time for the last category, emotions. This category is the most subjective out of all, but it has the second biggest weight, 3. Even though it's all about personal feelings, they do matter a lot and greatly define our experience with a certain title. And I'll open up the scores immediately here too, as I don't really need to spend a lot of time in this category today. The assigned score is a 9. Despite some of the flaws that Return of the King has, it is very enjoyable to go through the game as different characters. By the time of writing this, I have spent around 45 hours in the game, having played it as every character and some repeatedly, and honestly, I wouldn't mind spending more time in it after. Let's summarize everything now. After all scores and weights are taken into account, Return of the King for GBA gets a final Stasocritic rating of 74. It is a good, fun game. If you don't like hack and slash titles, Return of the King won't do anything to change your mind, but if you're fine with the genre, there's good times to be had. I honestly wish there would have been one additional iteration of this game. I feel like another try on the same foundation would give us a true hack and slash classic. Sadly, there wasn't, but still, Return of the King is fun. By the way, this game is not the only handheld tie-in that the Return of the King movie had. There was also one for mobile phones. If you're interested in checking it out, you'll find a link to the video about it in description and YouTube cards. Thank you all for watching. If you have enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe and leave a comment below. A special thank you goes to my patrons without whom I wouldn't be able to make these videos, the support means a lot. If you'd like, consider checking out my campaign at patreon.com/Parlance. Thank you.